Welcome to Brew Cheese, where we brew up the finest of cheese. And today I have for you a deck tech in Shirei, Shizo's Caretaker. Shirei, Shizo's Caretaker is a black and 4 for a 2/2 legendary spirit. It has, whenever a creature with power 1 or less is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you may return that card to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step if Shirei, Shizo's Caretaker is still on the battlefield. Shirei is an extremely versatile commander, and when most people look at it, they see, well, something to use for an Aristocrats build. You know, if you're going to have a lot of small 1-power creatures dying and coming back, well, that lends itself well to Aristocrats, doesn't it? But I am here to present you with 4 different ways you can build Shirei. Let's get started. With the core of the deck, this will be the unchanged portion from one deck to the next. The only thing changing after this will be what I call the payload, or what is different from one deck to the next and how the deck is going to ultimately try to win. So let's get started with the core. We start our mana base with just 36 swamps. No frills, just 36 swamps. We begin our ramp package with Gleaming Barrier. It's a 2-mana artifact creature wall, 0/4 defender. When it dies, we create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Gleaming Barrier is a workhorse in this deck. We can sacrifice it on our turn, make a treasure. Sacrifice it on the next guy's turn, make a treasure. Sacrifice it on the next player's turn, make a treasure. You get the idea. 1 round around the table, 4 treasure tokens. We continue with Plague Mirror, Mannequin, and Hedron Crawler, all of which just cost 2 and tap for a colorless. You'll also note that they're all creatures with power 1 or less, meaning that if we have to use them for our sacrifice engine, well, we'll get them back. If we have to use them to chump block, we get them back. In essence, we have a little bit more insurance using creature-based mana sources than most decks do. Overeager Apprentice. It's a black and 2 for a 1/2 human minion. We can discard a card and sacrifice it to add 3 black to our mana pool. Of course, since it's a 1-power creature, Shirei brings it back at the end of the turn, meaning that 1 card per turn becomes a free Dark Ritual. That's a phenomenal deal. Walking Atlas. It's a 2-mana 1/1 creature construct. Tap. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. The deck actually has an incredible amount of card draw, and, well, being able to put some of those extra lands from your hand straight onto the battlefield and ramp twice as hard as everybody else is, well, that's just fantastic, trust me. We continue with Charcoal Diamond and Leaden Mirror, both of which cost 2 and tap for a black. But we can't use them the turn they come into play unless we somehow get haste. Probably not going to happen, but... Blood Pet, 1 black for a 1/1 creature thrall. We can sacrifice it to add a black to our mana pool. We can do this on our turn, on the next player's turn, you get the idea. We don't have a lot of instant speed effects, but it's nice to know that it's there if we want to activate an ability on our opponent's turn, such as one of our other sacrifice outlets. Pilgrim's Eye is 3 mana for a 1/1 artifact creature Thopter. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, we may search our library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into our hand, and shuffle our library. This is another reason that we included Walking Atlas in, so that we can use this on every turn and go get multiple basic lands and throw them all into play. Pawn of Ulamog, 2 black and 1 for a 2/2 vampire shaman. Whenever it or another non-token creature we control dies, you may create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token. It has sacrifice this creature, add a colorless to your mana pool. We are going to be sacrificing a lot of non-token creatures, and we are going to be doing it on every player's turn. This thing can create so many Eldrazi spawn that we have chump blockers for days, we have colorless mana for days. Dark Privilege. It's a black and 1 for a creature enchantment, and this also begins our sacrifice outlets. It gives our creature +1/+1 and the ability to sacrifice another creature to regenerate the enchanted creature. Not only is this a free sacrifice outlet, it also protects our commander. We can regenerate it either when there's a threat present or even before a threat happens. Your creature doesn't even have to be dying to regenerate it anymore. Swiftfoot Boots and Mask of Avacyn both cost 2 and serve to give our commander hexproof. Well, this commander is extremely centric to how the deck needs to function. If it's not out, it's probably not going to function all that well. We have one-shot creatures then. But we have plenty of things in the deck to protect it. And with that, we continue with Whisper Silk Cloak and Cloak and Dagger, both of which serve to give our commander Shroud. Kaya's Ghost Form. It's a black for an enchantment aura. It enchants a creature or a planeswalker we control. When enchanted permanent dies or is put into exile, return that card to the battlefield under your control. This is a one-use insurance policy against board wipes. Fetid Imp and Stinkweed Imp serve to protect us more than anything. They're both in here to be flying Death Touch creatures with 1 power, so Shirei, of course, brings them back. And hey, flying Death Touch creatures, if that isn't a way to say attack that other guy instead, I don't know what is. Our board wipe package consists of Crux of Fate, Deathbringer Regent, and Nevinyrral's Disc. Crux of Fate is 2 black and 3 for a sorcery. We can choose to destroy all dragon creatures or all non-dragon creatures. Deathbringer Regent is a 5/6 dragon with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, if we cast it from our hand and there are 5 or more other creatures on the battlefield, we destroy all other creatures. And Nevinyrral's Disc, 4 mana artifact that enters the battlefield tapped. We can pay 1 and tap to destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. Black has quite a bit of difficulty getting rid of artifacts and enchantments, so the ability to wipe those out is very handy. Cadaver Imp, Death Denied, and Dutiful Attendant form our recovery suite. This is the cards that we're going to employ to try to recover from something like a board wipe, or spot removal when our commander isn't out, or other important pieces that the commander did not bring back because its power was greater than 1. Cadaver Imp is a 1/1 flying imp. When it enters the battlefield, we may return target creature card from our graveyard to our hand. Death Denied is 2 black and X for an instant. Return X target creature cards from our graveyard to our hand. And Dutiful Attendant is black and 2 for a 1/2 human warrior. When it dies, return another target creature card from our graveyard to our hand. Personally, of these, Death Denied is probably the most flexible. At instant speed, at the end of an opponent's turn, we can just grab everything from our graveyard, chuck it back in our hand, and on our turn, just deploy it all again. We continue our sacrifice outlets here with Bloodthrone Vampire. That's a black and 1 for a 1/1 vampire that we can sacrifice it to give it +2/+2 until end of turn. And Carrion Feeder, which is 1 black for a 1/1 zombie. It can't block, and we can sacrifice a creature to put a +1/+1 counter on it. And with these 2 sacrifice outlets, we need to have a brief discussion of the stack. Because our commander won't bring these back if they're bigger than 1 power, what we'll have to do is sacrifice creatures to it, and then with those triggers on the stack, sacrifice this creature to itself. That way it won't be on the battlefield to receive the +2/+2 or the +1/+1 counter, and it dies as a 1/1 creature, and thus commander brings it all back. Priests of Forgotten Gods. It's 1 black and 1 for a 1/2 human cleric. You can tap and sacrifice 2 other creatures to force any number of target players to each lose 2 life and sacrifice a creature. We add 2 black and draw a card. This is a 1 per turn sacrifice outlet rather than an on-demand one, but I feel that it sacrificing 2 creatures and forcing every other player to sacrifice something and lose 2 life and give us 2 black and draw a card is well worth it. Fallen Ideal is 1 black and 2 for an enchantment aura. It's an enchant creature. Enchanted creature has flying, and sacrifice a creature. This creature gets +2/+1 until end of turn. When Fallen Ideal is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return Fallen Ideal to its owner's hand. This is a phenomenal sacrifice outlet, because not only is it a free one, we can actually use it to sacrifice a bunch of creatures to pump up our commander's power and toughness if we need to try to evade some red damage-based removal, either in the form of a board wipe or spot removal. Also, should our commander fall, well, this goes from our graveyard back to our hand to go back on it when we recast our commander. And we have a sacrifice outlet always online unless this gets exiled as well. Viscera Seer. It's 1 black and 1 black for a 1/1 vampire wizard that allows us to sacrifice a creature to scry 1. This is a staple of any Aristocratsy build, and to be honest, the core of the deck is slightly Aristocratsy, but we're going to be differing a little later down the road. You'll see. I've included this despite the cost because there's a lot of card draw in here that triggers when our creatures die. The ability to scry 1 before you draw is very valuable. We want to try to reduce the number of lands we're drawing because we're already going to be going through our deck and getting a few extra. We just want to draw nothing but fuel. The ability to scry first before drawing has proven extremely valuable in all of my playtests with this. Vampiric Rites and Thallid Soothsayer. Vampiric Rites is 1 black for an enchantment. We can pay 1 and a black and sacrifice a creature to gain 1 life and draw a card. Thallid Soothsayer is a black and 3 for a 2/3 fungus. We can pay 2, sacrifice a creature, and draw a card. These aren't the greatest of sacrifice outlets, but in a pinch, we can pay to sacrifice a creature, and it draws us a card to try to get a better sacrifice outlet. But if we don't, well, it's actually not too big a hit to pay 2 a turn for each creature. We're going to be generating a lot of mana. Smothering Abomination. While not truly a sacrifice outlet, this is an extremely valuable card in the deck. It's 2 black and 2 for a 4/3 Eldrazi with Devoid and flying. At the beginning of our upkeep, we sacrifice a creature, and whenever we do sacrifice a creature, we draw a card. We have to be a little careful with this not to deck ourselves eventually, but hopefully we've won the game before then. Underworld Connections. It's 2 black and 1 for an enchantment aura. It's an enchant land, and it gives that land the ability to tap and pay a life to draw a card. This also sort of begins our draw package, although Smothering Abomination was the blurry line between sacrifice outlet and draw package. That continues with Dark Prophecy. It's 3 black for an enchantment. Whenever a creature we control dies, we draw a card and lose a life. This is another one we have to kind of watch, because if we have gone off and we have a ton of tokens on the board and we get board wiped, we are going to lose a lot of life and draw a lot of cards. Grim Haruspex. It's a black and 2 for a 3/2 human wizard with morph for a black if you ever want to use that. Whenever another non-token creature we control dies, we draw a card. Harvester of Souls. 2 black and 4 for a 5/5 death-touching demon. Whenever another non-token creature, ours or our opponent's, dies, we may draw a card. We are going to also be forcing our opponents to sacrifice some things. We're going to be destroying a few things. This card draws a lot more than anything else. Sky Scanner and Dusk Legion Zealot. Sky Scanner is a 3-mana 1/1 artifact creature Thopter with flying. Whenever it enters the battlefield, we draw a card. Dusk Legion Zealot is a black and 1 for a 1/1 vampire soldier. When it enters the battlefield, we draw a card and lose a life. Mindless Automaton. This is 4 mana for a 0/0 artifact creature construct. It enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. We can pay 1 and discard a card to put a +1/+1 counter on Mindless Automaton. Remove 2 +1/+1 counters from Mindless Automaton, draw a card. We're mostly going to be only using the last ability. On our turn, we can remove the 2 counters from it, making it a 0/0, and we draw a card, it dies, and Shirei brings it back at the end of the turn because it's now power 1 or less. On the next player's turn, we remove 2 counters to draw a card. This is exactly what we're going to be doing with things like Skyscanner and Dusk Legion Zealot, is sacrificing them and drawing a card on every player's turn. We begin our removal package with Royal Assassin. 2 black and 1 for a 1/1 human assassin. You can tap it to destroy target tapped creature. Now if you're an older Magic player like me, you have sat across the table from this, maybe a Sorceress Queen and a couple of Thames, and you remember the feeling of helplessness. In Commander, Royal Assassin is just as good. It's usually the target of removal almost immediately, but since it's a 1-power creature, it has a little extra insurance in our deck. Abyssal Gatekeeper. It's a black and 1 for a 1/1 horror. When Abyssal Gatekeeper dies, each player, that's us and opponents, sacrifices a creature, but we don't mind sacrificing creatures at all. Now if we can sacrifice this on our turn, the next player's turn, the next player's turn, you get it. That's 4 creatures every opponent is going to need to sacrifice every time around the table. Just this creature alone makes it to where it is hard to keep a creature out on the battlefield. Butcher of Malakir. It's 2 black and 5 for a 5/4 flying vampire warrior. Whenever it or another creature we control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. With the amount of creatures we are going to be sacrificing over and over and over again, this creates an extremely toxic board state where nothing can survive. Not unless you have completely gone off with some sort of, Earthcraft Squirrel's Nest thing and generated 4 million squirrels. You're going to be out of creatures. Spark Harvest. It's 1 black for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast a spell, we sacrifice a creature or pay 3 and a black to destroy target creature or planeswalker. This is the few things in the deck that can target a planeswalker. It can also target a creature, of course. It also acts as a temporary sacrifice outlet should we not be able to find anything else. Big Game Hunter and Bone Shredder. Big Game Hunter is 2 black and 1 for a 1/1 human rebel assassin. When it enters the battlefield, we destroy target creature with power 4 or greater, and it can't be regenerated. It also has madness for a black if that ever comes up. Now, this is not going to always come in handy. It's only going to destroy power 4 or greater creatures. But it can sit here and mow down one after the other, creating a board state where only the meek survive. Bone Shredder is a black and 2 for a 1/1 minion with flying, and Echo for 2 and a black. I'll get to that in a moment. Whenever it enters the battlefield, we destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature. Now the Echo means that at the beginning of the upkeep, after this came under our control, then we have to sacrifice it unless we pay its Echo cost. Spoiler, we are never ever going to pay the Echo cost, because we want to sacrifice this. Now we get to the first payload. Again, this is where the different decks, differ. We're going to try and win this style with nothing but a horde of zombie tokens. There is one major restriction with Shirei. If we include anything in the deck that pumps up all zombies by +1/+1, well, some of our zombies are no longer 1 power. So things like that are going to break the deck. So you won't see them here, and we won't be including them. We start this with Lazotep Reaver. It's 1 black and 1 for a 1/2 zombie beast. When it enters the battlefield, we amass 1. Vizier of the Scorpion is a black and 2 for a 1/1 zombie wizard, and when it enters the battlefield, we amass 1. But he also gives all of our zombie tokens Death Touch. We're only going to be building up 1 big zombie army, not to be confused with a zombie horde. But, Dread Horde Invasion also adds to that. 1 black and 1. It's an enchantment. At the beginning of our upkeep, we lose a life and amass 1. Whenever a zombie token we control with power 6 or greater attacks, it gains lifelink until end of turn. Even though we're only building up one zombie, it's very likely going to become power 6 or greater in no time. We're going to get some of the life gain back from all the life payment we did in drawing cards earlier. Doomed Dissenter, 1 black and 1 for a 1/1. When it dies, we create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Again, we can sacrifice this on our turn, the next player's turn, and so on, making a horde of zombies in no time. But this pales in comparison to what the deck can do with the next creature. Noosegraph Mob, 2 black and 4 for a 0/0 zombie. It enters the battlefield with 5+1/+1 counters on it. Whenever a player casts a spell, we remove a +1/+1 counter from it, and if we do, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. As long as nobody touches this and kills it before it goes down to power 1, well, it'll die as a 0/0, and Shirei brings it back to make 5 more zombies. So, we are going to generate a veritable zombie horde with this card alone. Cryptbreaker, 1 black for a 1/1 zombie. We can pay 1 and a black and tap it and discard a card to put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield. We can also tap 3 untapped zombies we control to draw a card and lose a life. Like I said, we have a lot of card draw in the deck, and we're not going to be able to play it all, especially all those lands. We might as well put them to use, increasing our zombie horde. And speaking of card draw, we can tap a lot of those zombies to draw more cards. Curse of Disturbance, Curse of Shallow Graves, and Bitterheart Witch. Curse of Disturbance and Curse of Shallow Graves are more or less the same. They're a black and 2, they're a curse that goes on a player, and whenever a player attacks the enchanted player, the attacker gets a 2/2 black zombie creature token. The only thing that really differs is Curse of Disturbance is each opponent, you get a black zombie creature token whenever an opponent attacks that player as well. We have Bitterheart Witch. It's a 1 power creature with Death Touch. It's a human shaman. When it dies, we can search our library for a curse, put it onto the battlefield attached to target player, and then shuffle our library. So she makes it a little easier to tutor these up. To be honest, if better zombie token generation comes out in future sets, these 3 cards are probably what I would swap out. But for a budget build, especially one that is not looking to bump up all of our zombies, these will do. Open the Graves, 2 black and 3. It's an enchantment. Whenever a non-token creature we control dies, which happens a lot, we create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Zathrid Necromancer. It's a black and 2 for a 2/2 human wizard. Whenever Zathrid Necromancer or another human creature we control dies, put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield tapped. Now, there's only 6 other humans in the deck, but the 6 other humans we do have, we're going to be cycling through a lot. So don't worry about the shortage of humans. Doomed Dissenter, for instance. It's a human. We sacrifice it and make 2 zombies. If we have Open the Graves on the battlefield, we make 3 zombies. Archetype of Finality. It's 2 black and 4 for a 2/3 enchantment creature Gorgon. Gives all of our creatures Death Touch and removes Death Touch from all of our opponent's creatures, and they can't have or gain it. This doesn't exactly scream zombies, but if we're going to build up a horde of 2/2 creatures, we might as well make them very intimidating to attack into. Graph Harvest. 1 black for an enchantment. Zombies we control have Menace. Well, if we're going to have a zombie horde, let's get them through. It also lets us pay 3 and a black to exile a creature card from our graveyard to create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Hopefully there shouldn't be creature cards in our graveyard, but it happens. We might as well put them to use. Shepherd of Rot. 1 black and 1 for a 1/1 zombie cleric. We can tap it to have each player lose 1 life for each zombie on the battlefield. This is another one we have to be a little careful with, and make sure that our zombie hordes are, chewing down our opponents faster than this can chew us down. But if we play our cards right, pun fully intended, then this will do more damage to them than to us overall. Plague Belcher. It's a black and 2 for a 5/4 zombie beast with menace. When it enters the battlefield, we put 2 -1/-1 counters on a creature we control. Whenever another zombie we control dies, each opponent loses 1 life. We might as well punish our zombies for taking out our zombies. And we can actually put those 2 -1/-1 counters on one of our zombies if we want, or one of our other sacrifice fodder, and of course it comes right back. We can even put it on a 2-power creature, and it'll die as a 0/0. Call to the Grave. It's a black and 4 for an enchantment. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices a non-zombie creature. At the beginning of the end step, if no creatures are on the battlefield, sacrifice Call to the Grave. We, of course, don't mind sacrificing creatures at all. Our opponents, however, may have a different view. Dark Salvation. It's 1 black and double X for a sorcery. Target player creates X 2/2 black zombie creature tokens, and then up to 1 target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn for each zombie that player controls. Not only can we generate more zombie tokens with this, we can remove a creature. Moreover, we can remove a creature that has something like Indestructible, since this gives it -X/-X until end of turn. That concludes our zombie payload, and we begin Artifacts. This is where we're going to use primarily artifact synergy, not something you commonly find in mono black. This begins with Skittering Surveyor. This is more or less copy number 2 of Pilgrim's Eye, but I included it here because, well, we're trying to flesh out more constructs, more artifacts, and we could actually use the extra lands. You'll see. 3 mana for a 1/2 artifact creature construct. When it enters the battlefield, we search our library for a basic land, reveal it, put it in our hand, and then shuffle our library. Battle at the Bridge. It's a black and X for a sorcery, and we can improvise it. We can tap our artifacts to help pay for it and make it bigger. Target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn, and we gain X life. This can be a huge life gain if we need it to, or it can get rid of an indestructible creature or 1 problematic creature. Contract Killing is another kill spell for this deck. It's 2 black and 3 for a sorcery. We destroy target creature, create 2 treasure tokens. Now, treasure tokens, you'll see, play a little bit of a bigger role in this build. Phyrexian Scriptures, 2 black and 2. It's an enchantment saga. And with the first counter, we put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature. That creature becomes an artifact in addition to its other types. We're most likely going to be putting this on Shirei to make her, an artifact, so that with counter number 2, where we destroy all non-artifact creatures, this acts like a one-sided board wipe. We don't too much care about counter number 3, but it's nice when we're playing against graveyard synergy decks like Muldrotha. We exile all cards from all opponents' graveyards. Mirror and Weaponcraft Enthusiast. Mirror is a 2 mana 1/1 mirror artifact creature. When it dies, we create a 1/1 colorless mirror artifact creature token. Weaponcraft Enthusiast is a 0/1 Aetherborn Artificer with Fabricate 2, which most of the time we're going to use to create 2 1/1 colorless servo artifact creatures. And since this is a creature with power 1 or less, we can generate 2 of those every turn that we sacrifice Weaponcraft Enthusiast. Ruthless Knave, 1 black and 2 for a 3/2 Orc Pirate. We can pay 2 and a black and sacrifice a creature to create 2 colorless treasure artifact tokens. Pitiless Plunderer, black and 3 for a 1/4 Human Pirate. Whenever another creature we control dies, create a colorless treasure artifact token. Pitiless Plunder is one you may want to consider moving to the main board, but considering we were going so heavily into artifact synergies, I decided to move it to the artifact payload. Spawning Pit, 2 mana for an artifact. We can sacrifice a creature to put a charge counter on Spawning Pit, and then we can pay 1 and remove 2 charge counters from it to create a 2/2 colorless spawn artifact creature token. But this is not only yet another sec outlet, it creates more artifacts. Not only that, it can create a horde of artifact creatures. Genesis Chamber. It's 2 mana for an artifact. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, if Genesis Chamber is untapped, that creature's controller creates a 1/1 colorless mirror artifact creature token. This is going to help our opponent too, but considering every single turn we're going to be recycling 3, 4, maybe even 5 creatures that are all going to be entering the battlefield on every player's turn, I'd say we get a lot more value out of this than our opponents will. Sly Requisitioner is a black and 4 for a 2/2 with Improvise, meaning our artifacts can help cast it. Whenever a non-token artifact we control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, which again happens on every player's turn, probably 3, 4, 5 times, create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. Lightning Coils. This is without a doubt one of the best cards in this build, although it's not immediately apparent. It's 3 mana for an artifact. Whenever a non-token creature we control is put into a graveyard from play, you put a charge counter on it. At the beginning of our upkeep, if Lightning Coils has 5 or more charge counters on it, remove all of them from it and put that many 3/1 red elemental creature tokens with haste into play, and those are removed from the game at the end of the turn. Imagine this scenario. We have just, say, 3 creatures. We sacrifice them on our turn. Put 3 counters on this. On the next player's turn, 3 more counters, and so on and so on. By the time it gets around to our next upkeep, there are 12 charge counters on this. We remove them all and make 12 3/1 elemental tokens that all swing in immediately. And we don't even have to sacrifice Lightning Coils to do it, like we might with similar things that build up charges. No, we can repeat it. If we're playing in a game with more than 3 opponents, or if we have more than, say, those 3 creatures to sacrifice every turn, then this scales up immensely. One of the best things about Shirei is that it scales greatly with how many opponents we have, since we can activate our abilities on every player's turn. That being said, the opposite is also true. In a 1 versus 1 match, Shirei does lack some punch. Revel in Riches. You probably knew this was coming with all of the treasure synergy happening, but here it is. It's a black and 4 for an enchantment. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, we create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap. You know what treasures do. At the beginning of our upkeep, if we control 10 or more treasures, we win the game. Well, considering we're building up treasures left and right with the things in this package and things like Gleaming Barrier, and we're also killing creatures left and right with things like Bone Shredder, the abominable thingy-doo that makes everybody sacrifice things, Butcher of Malakir, we're probably going to be building up treasure from its first ability too. Marionette Master and Disciple of the Vault. They more or less flesh out the same role. Marionette Master, it's 2 black and 4 for a 1/3 with Fabricate 3. Whenever an artifact we control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to Marionette Master's power. Similar to Weaponcraft Enthusiast, we can just cycle this on every player's turn to make 3 1/1 servos. When we're tired of doing that, though, we can put it back into play as a 4/7 and start sacrificing all of those artifacts to mow down opponents left and right. Or we can even leave it as a 1-power creature just for the extra insurance and sacrifice a whole ton of artifacts, treasures, what have you, and punish our opponents. Disciple of the Vault fills a similar role. It's 1 black for a 1/1, and whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from play, that's ours or our opponent's, but that's more likely going to come into play for us, you may have target opponent lose 1 life. Nim Shambler and Nim Devourer. Nim Shambler is a 2 black and 2 for a 2/1 zombie. It gets +1/+0 for each artifact we control, and we can sacrifice a creature to regenerate it. Nim Devourer is 2 black and 3 for a 4/1 that also gets +1/+0 for each artifact we control. We can pay 2 black to return it from our graveyard to the battlefield, and then sacrifice a creature. We can only do that during our upkeep. Now, these aren't fancy and have evasive abilities like Trample, but they do get immensely big, and they are problematic to deal with, since we can sacrifice creatures on both of these to bring them back. Nim Devourer especially, unless it gets exiled, is very hard to keep down. That concludes the artifact payload, and we begin with probably one of my favorites, Discard. Now, most discard decks, whether in Commander or not, suffer from one problem. A lot of discard effects are sorcery speed, meaning our opponent gets a chance to draw a card, use it, pass turn, and then if they didn't use it, we get to make them discard it. That's not the problem with this deck. Burglar Rat. 1 black and 1 for a 1/1 rat. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. Yarick's Fenlurker. 2 black for a 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent exiles a card. And Noxious Toad. I'll have to translate from Portal speak here. 1 black and 2 for a 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. Noxious Toad, out of all of these, I'm sorry, and when it dies, I'm sorry, my Portal speak is a little rusty. When it dies, each opponent discards a card. Noxious Toad here is actually especially useful in the deck because we can, when an opponent draws, immediately sacrifice this, and unless they have an instant in hand, force them to discard. Not only them, all of our opponents. The rest of these two, well, they'll have to come back at the end step and force them to discard then. But we can still do that on every turn, making all of our opponents discard 4 cards for each round around the table. Or 5 if we have 4 opponents. 6 if we're playing with an especially large board. You get the idea. Like I said, Shirei scales very well with the number of opponents. Mindlash Sliver. It's 1 black for a 1/1, and it gives all other slivers the ability to pay 1 and sacrifice this creature to make each player discard a card. This is going to affect us too, unfortunately, and this is also the only sliver in the deck. But we have it mostly in here because it can sacrifice itself, so if we don't have a sacrifice outlet, we are still, chugging along at some speed, and it makes each player discard a card. We have a lot of card draw in the deck, so we shouldn't be punished too badly for it. Mesmeric Fiend. 1 black and 1 for a 1/1 Nightmare Horror. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals his or her hand, and we choose a non-land card from it. Exile that card. When Mesmeric Fiend leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to its owner's hand. Now, this might look like just a fancy Oblivion Ring for somebody's hand, but it's not. We have to have another brief discussion of the stack here. Let's say, on our turn, we cast Mesmeric Fiend. It hits the battlefield. With the enters the battlefield effect still on the trigger, we sacrifice it. That puts the leaves the battlefield trigger on the stack above the enter the battlefield trigger, meaning it leaves the battlefield, that part happens first, and we return an exiled card to its owner's hand, but nothing has been exiled yet. And then the enters the battlefield trigger happens, and we exile a card from an opponent's hand, never to be seen again. At the end of the turn, it comes back. We can do the exact same thing. When it enters the battlefield again, while that trigger's on the stack, we sacrifice it. Now this, like the Yarick's Fenlurker, is exile rather than discard. That may seem like semantics, but some cards care about our opponents discarding cards, and they will not trigger with these. But they are still good exile effects, and so we're going to use them, especially since some decks, like I mentioned, maybe Muldrotha, like for you to pitch stuff in their graveyard. We are going to try and deny them that ability. Ashen Skin Zubera is 1 black and 1 for a 1/2 Zubera Spirit. Whenever it's put into a graveyard from play, target opponent discards a card for each Zubera put into a graveyard from play. Considering this is the only Zubera in the deck, it more or less reads, when it dies, target opponent discards a card. Black Cat is 1 black and 1 for a 1/1, and when it dies, target opponent discards a card, but this time at random. Random, that's always good. Ravenous Rats, 1 black and 1 for a 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent discards a card. Thieving Sprite, 1 black and 2 for a 1/1 flying. When it enters the battlefield, target player reveals X cards from his or her hand, where X is the number of fairies we control, probably going to be 1, just this guy. And we choose one of those cards, and that player discards that card. So again, this might as well read, when this enters the battlefield, Target player reveals a random card, whatever they want out of their hand, although not random, they pick it, and then we choose them to discard that card. Disciple of Phoenix is a little bit more powerful. It's 2 black and 2 for a 1/3 human cleric. When it enters the battlefield, target player reveals a number of cards from his or her hand equal to my devotion to black. We choose one of them, and that player discards that card. Again, this is a little worse than getting to look at their whole hand and pick something, but it's a whole lot better than them choosing something to discard. Fell Spectre. This is another one of those that kind of blurs the line between two categories. Fell Spectre is a black and 3 for a 1/3 flying spectre. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent discards a card. Whenever an opponent discards a card, that player loses 2 life. Since this is a 1-power creature, of course, we can cycle it on every player's turn, making an opponent of our choice discard a card. And it also is the beginning of our punish effects, the things that are going to punish opponents for having the gall to discard cards. It's going to make them lose 2 life every time they do. And that trend continues with Megrim. That's a black and 2 for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent discards a card, Megrim deals 2 damage to that player. And Raider's Wake is a black and 3 for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent discards a card, that player loses 2 life. And it has Raid. At the beginning of our end step, if we attacked with a creature this turn, target opponent discards a card. We're not going to be attacking a lot, but hey, maybe it happens. Maybe there's an empty board on somebody's side and we want to chip in some damage and get in an extra discard. Davriel Rogue Shadow Mage. It's a black and 2 for a 3 loyalty Planeswalker. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, Davriel Rogue Shadow Mage deals 2 damage to them, and we can -1 to make target player discard a card. And there's Quest for the Nile Stone. It's 1 black for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent discards a card, we may put a quest counter on Quest for the Nile Stone. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, and Quest for the Nile Stone has 2 or more quest counters on it, we may have that player lose 5 life. This is probably the best punish card in the deck, as long as we can keep a player empty-handed. Wheel of Torture. It's 3 mana for an artifact, and during each of our opponent's upkeeps, it deals 1 damage to that player for each card fewer than 3 in his or her hand. It's more or less a rack, but it affects all of our opponents. And Shrieking Affliction. 1 black for an enchantment. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, he or she loses 3 life. That concludes the discard payload, and this begins the final payload, Aristocrats. Well, when I said the deck was going to differ from other Aristocrats builds, well, it felt wrong to not include the original, the Aristocrats build, so to speak. This is not quite probably what you would call an Aristocrats build. The core of the deck would be closer to Aristocrats, where you're going to sacrifice creatures and punish people for them. But this is going to be the more punishing part. It's going to mostly focus around damage and life loss from sacrificing things. I'm going to make a deck that forces people to sacrifice, and they're going to pay for it. Fantastic. What do you call it? The Aristocrats. This begins with Tattered Mummy, 1 black and 1 for a 1/2 zombie jackal. When it dies, each opponent loses 2 life. Grim Guardian is a black and 2 for a 1/4 enchantment creature zombie. When it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under our control, each opponent loses 1 life. Calastria Healer is a black and 1 for a 1/2 vampire cleric ally, and whenever it or another ally enters the battlefield under our control, each opponent loses a life and we gain a life. Again, we can cycle these on every player's turn, and ping down the board pretty quickly. Bile Urchin is a black for a spirit 1/1. We can sacrifice it and have target player lose 1 life. Death Cultist is also a black for a 1/1. Human Wizard. We can sacrifice it to have a target player lose a life and we gain a life. These 2 are notable in that they have self-sacrifice abilities on them, so if we don't have a sack outlet out, they can still let us be chugging along. Infectious Host, a black and 2 for a 1/1 zombie. When it's put into a graveyard from play, target player loses 2 life. It's similar to Tattered Mummy, but costs a little bit more. Sling Gang Lieutenant. It's a black and 3 for a 1/1 goblin. When it enters the battlefield, we create two 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. We can sacrifice a goblin to have target player lose 1 life, and we gain 1 life. What we can do with this is we put it onto the battlefield, make the 2 goblins, we sack those 2 goblins to it, and then we sacrifice it to itself, thus killing it, and hitting something for 3, well, a player for 3, and we gain 3. And then, of course, it's a 1 power creature. It comes back. We can repeat that again on the next player's turn. Triskelion. It's 6 mana for a 1/1 artifact creature construct. It enters the battlefield with 3+1/+1 counters on it. We can remove one of those counters to have it deal 1 damage to target creature or player. Now, if we have a sack outlet in play, we can remove all 3 of these counters to deal 3 damage spread out how we like, and then sacrifice this as a 1/1 creature. If we don't have a sacrifice outlet out, no need to worry. We can hit something for 2, and then remove a counter from it to deal 1 damage to itself, and kill itself, so that it still comes back. Maggot Carrier. It's 1 black for a 1/1 zombie. When Maggot Carrier enters the battlefield, each player loses 1 life. Again, this is us too, but we should have some other life gain in the deck from things like the Colostria Healer. Gnawing Zombie. 1 black and 1 for a 1/3 zombie. It has 1 and a black, sacrifice a creature, target player loses 1 life, and we gain 1 life. If we're going to pay for a sack outlet, it might as well be a sack outlet that also continues our aristocracy theme. Carsey Sadist. It's a black and 1 for a 1/3 human cleric, with exploit, meaning when it enters the battlefield we can sacrifice a creature. And when it does exploit a creature, target opponent loses 2 life, and we gain 2 life. So not only does this also drain an opponent, it also sacks a creature doing it, which is something we want. Falconwrath Noble, Vindictive Vampire, and Zulport Cutthroat all form roughly the same role in the deck. Falconwrath Noble is a black and 3 for a 2/2 vampire with flying. When it or another creature dies, target player loses a life and we gain a life. Vindictive Vampire, black and 3 for a 2/3, not flying this time. Whenever another creature we control dies, it hits an opponent for 1 and we gain a life. And Zulport Cutthroat, when it or another creature we control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. Zulport Cutthroat, in my opinion, is one of the best in this deck, notably because it pings each opponent for 1 rather than just a single one, and it itself is a 1 power creature and triggers on its own death, meaning that once we're done sacking things and pinging people, we can sacrifice this as well for just 1 more little tiny stretch. Thought Picker Witch. It's 1 black for a 1/1 human wizard. We can pay 1 and sacrifice a creature to look at the top 2 cards of target opponent's library, then remove 1 of them from the game. This is a departure from dealing damage left and right by sacking things, and provides yet another sack outlet. Now, we have possibly all heard about Lantern Control and how effective it was. This is Lantern Control on a body. We can look at the top 2 cards of an opponent's deck and say, here, you get another basic land next turn. You get another basic land. Imagine that. So we can help set up some of our opponent's draws and keep them from getting answers. Shadows of the Past. 1 black and 1 for an enchantment. Whenever a creature dies, which happens a lot, we scry 1, which is fantastic. We can always make sure our next draw is going to be great. And speaking of, 4 and a black, each opponent loses 2 life, and we gain 2 life. There's the aristocrats we wanted. We can only activate that if there are 4 more creature cards in our graveyard, though. Again, we probably don't want that to happen, but it happens. Thrall Parasite. It's 1 black for a 1/1 Thrall. It has Extort, meaning whenever we cast a spell, we can pay either a white or a black, and if we do, each opponent loses a life and we gain that much life. It should be pointed out that things in reminder text do not count towards commander color identity, meaning that white mana symbol does not violate color identity in this deck. So this lets us pay 1 mana every time we cast something to drain everybody for a little bit more. We can tap it and pay 2 life and remove a counter from target non-land permanent. So this is actually also useful in trying to maybe keep a planeswalker from ulting, from You're removing +1/+1 counters from problematic things, charge counters from problematic things. Ultimately, this was kind of a last minute addition because we needed one more slot for the deck. And honestly, if your budget allows, put Blood Artist in instead. Except, again, that's about a $3 card. Alright, the cost breakdown for these decks. The core of the deck is going to cost you $15.70. Now that is without shipping. I should add that. The zombie package adds $5.14, bringing the total to a little over $20. The artifact payload, $4.71, bringing you to $20.41. Discard adds $3.38, bringing you to under $20. And Aristocrats is actually the cheapest of all. Maybe you can add the Blood Artist after all, for $17.26. Now, the reason I do not include shipping, I will discuss in a future video. Well, this has been the first video of the Brew Cheese YouTube channel. I'd like to thank all of our viewers, and if you liked what you saw in this video and you think others might as well, I know you hear it from every YouTuber, but please share it and subscribe. That way, well, others get to see it and also like it. I'd like to give a special thanks to everyone who helped in researching this episode.